Hi, and welcome to this video. My name's Gracie, and today I'm going to be continuing making a pair of mid-18th century stays. I'm doing this for the event COSI, or CosTube Symposium, which is CosTube's annual YouTube video collaboration weekend. So there's tons of content coming out this weekend if you are watching this on August 20th, the day it comes out. And I'll put a link in the description to all the schedules, and there's Instagram events, and so you can participate and see videos that you want to watch. It's a lot of fun. This is a continuation of yesterday's video wherein I fit some 18th century stays, and now I am sewing them up. And a little bit of a behind the scenes look. I am filming this on August 17th, 3 days before it comes out. I'm still not done with the stays, but I'm pretty sure that like the bulk of these hand sewn stays will have been done in the past week by the time that they are completed. So it is possible to speed sew stays. I would not recommend it, but there's a little look into my life. I'm gonna start rambling if I keep going on, so let's get into the sewing. I started out by pinning my pattern pieces to my fabric and tracing around them with a pencil. I cut each piece from a layer of heavy linen with 1 inch of allowance all around. This is because my pattern doesn't have seam allowance, and as I learned last year when making stays, it's important to have allowance at the top and bottom of a pair of stays when sewing, just in case the fabric shifts or the stays need to be lengthened for some reason. Next, I used the pieces I cut from the heavy linen as patterns to cut out each piece in a layer of medium linen and a layer of wool twill. Because my inspiration stays have 3 main layers, these stays will have 3 layers too. Once each piece was cut from all 3 fabrics, I began assembling the panels. First, a layer of medium linen, then a layer of heavy linen, and finally the wool twill outer fabric. I was careful to make sure that my panels were mirror images of each other. If they weren't, the stays wouldn't have gone together properly. Once my panels were assembled, I pinned the correct pattern piece to each panel. I traced around the pinned pattern pieces with a pencil, and after removing the pattern piece, I basted around the traced outline. This technique prevents the panels from shifting much better than just pinning, and it is useful for defining the edges of each piece and where the seam allowance will begin. Next, I traced the 1/4 inch boning channels onto each panel using a clear ruler. Because I had gridded my pattern, I was able to eye where each panel should be, but to ensure that they were symmetrical, I drew a channel on one panel and then drew the same on its mirror. For the curved channels on the 4th panel, I used the same technique, eyeballing the channel with a ruler and my gridded pattern. With all of the channels drawn, I was able to begin stitching. The channels were all stitched by hand using a back stitch in lightweight linen thread, but if you wanted to use a sewing machine, the effect is nearly identical and it is much, much faster. I was tempted to use a sewing machine at parts during this process. It was taking so long. To avoid warping, I stitched each channel from top to bottom. When I made my stays last year, I had some serious issues with my fabric shifting, which I attribute partially to too tight stitches on a piece of fabric held at a slight curve. To avoid this, I very intentionally held my fabric as flat as possible, and I tried to make sure that my stitches weren't too tight. Being mindful about my stitches helped me avoid most of the problem, and the shifting on this set of stays was minimal. I am working on the back panel now, and there are a few things that I wanted to explain face to face as I'm doing them. So I stitched this seam along the center back of the stays, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start sewing the next few channels, but first I have to fold under this excess seam allowance. And This is somewhat of an experiment. I don't think this is what they did in the period, but I think it will help me. I'm going to cut away these 2 extra layers of linen here, and that will give me just 4 layers to sew through rather than 6, but it'll still give me like a wool backing for the eyelets, which is what you see in a lot of period stays. And then I'm gonna start sewing the rest of the channels, and then the eyelets, of course. Love that. The other thing, which I just made a mistake on that I thought some of you might find funny, this panel is in the wrong order. I have the looser weave, lighter colored linen as the innermost layer, which on all the other panels, it's the tighter weave, darker colored linen that's the innermost layer. I'm just gonna leave it because I don't want to unpick my stitches, but it's kind of funny. I think I would not be surprised if there were stays where the stay maker made a similar mistake and just like, yeah, whatever. I don't know any examples though, so if you have any examples, please leave a comment. I guess after I do the cutting, I will get to the stitching. I folded over the wool seam allowance on the back panel and secured it with pins. Basting would have been more secure and less pokey here, but pinning was faster, and because precision wasn't essential, pinning was the option that I chose. Once a few more channels were sewn in the back panel, I began sewing my eyelets. I marked the eyelet location according to the pattern in Costume Close-Up, and I used a metal awl to punch holes where the eyelets were to go, and then a bone awl to widen those holes. A knitting needle or pencil would also work to widen the holes created by a craft awl if you don't have a larger awl. Using waxed heavyweight linen thread, I stitched around each eyelet hole. I stitched around each eyelet twice until the thread was dense enough that it doesn't fray. Heavier weight thread like this stands up to wear and tear, but I may eventually reinforce the eyelets with a strip of leather, like in the extant example upon which these are based. If you'd be interested in seeing a video about that, let me know. It was at this point that I basted my stays together for the fitting that you may have seen in the previous video. I find that the best way to do this is to fold under the seam allowance on one panel and roughly whip stitch it to the seam line of an adjacent panel. Once the channels were stitched, I outlined my panels in back stitches using heavy linen thread. I find that this gives a clear line defining where to fold over the seam allowance, and it clearly marks where the channels end, which is useful when adding boning. However, because these stitches will be hidden when the stays are constructed, I generally make them less neat than the stitches for my channels. For these stays, I decided to use narrow reproduction whalebone as boning. This has the benefit of being much sturdier than cane, but it's also much more difficult to cut and smooth. However, my mother is rather handy, so to deal with the plastic boning, she put a sanding attachment on her power drill, and we secured it to a table outside with a clamp. After cutting each bone to the correct length using tin snips, I held the ends of the bones against the sander until they were smooth. This will prevent the bones from damaging the fabric of the stays. If you're making stays at home, I would recommend sanding your boning outside or in a well-ventilated area, regardless of material, in order to avoid inhaling particulate matter. For the bones that were to go in a curved channel, I attempted to curve them ahead of time by soaking them in boiling water, to mixed success. This might work better if you attempted to soak the plastic in a pot of boiling water, but I was worried about plastic particles somehow melting onto a cooking pot, so instead I used a kettle and a teacup. For the most part, I put the bones into their channels as I was sanding in order to prevent getting confused, but I saved one panel aside so I could show you the process of filling each channel. As long as your channels are a little bit bigger than your bones, this shouldn't be too hard, but if your channels are too small, it can be a struggle. For a few of the shorter channels at the top of the stays where there was little risk of breakage, I used reed instead of plastic whalebone because it was fairly difficult to sand little pieces of plastic, even with the gloves I was wearing. Once each panel had bones, I folded over the seam allowance and secured them to the insides of the stays with rough whip stitches and heavy-weight linen thread. These stitches will be hidden by an eventual lining, so I chose speed over beauty here. The seam allowances sometimes had to be trimmed to make it easier to secure them down, but I generally tried to avoid this where possible. If I ever went to expand these stays, those seam allowances could be useful. I wanted to try a new technique with these stays, so I folded the seam allowance over on the bottom edge of each panel in addition to the sides, including on the tabs. My friend Anna has recommended folding over the seam allowance on the top of the stays to prevent the boning from sticking through the binding, but that for me is usually an issue around the tabs than around the upper edge. Additionally, I have heard people who've examined extant stays explain that tabs of stays are sometimes extremely thick. With the boning and the fabric, my stays are probably less than 1/8 of an inch thick, so I thought that folding over the seam allowance on the tabs would add extra thickness that could be covered by the lining. This was an extremely fiddly process, as everything's with tabs tends to be, and my stitches aren't particularly nice looking. But I think that folding over the seam allowance on the tabs is a useful technique, especially before binding, upon which I will elaborate soon. Once all of the seam allowances were whipped down, I butted the edges of the panels together and secured them with whip stitches and heavy linen thread through the barest edge of each panel. This makes flexible stays that are strong and can be easily taken apart for alterations. After I had stitched the stays together, I whip stitched the top seam allowance down as well, per Anna's recommendation, once again using big ugly whip stitches and heavyweight linen thread. The final step of making these stays was binding. If I had wanted to add decorative tape over the seams, I would have done so before binding, but for now, these stays will remain without seam tape. My favorite material for binding stays is wool tape because it is flexible and easy to work with, unlike linen tape or leather. I started out by whip stitching the edge of my wool tape a few millimeters away from the top of my stays. Once the tape was stitched to the outside of the stays, it was folded over and the other edge was whip stitched to the interior of the stays. The folded over seam allowances make it easier to anchor my stitches, and they prevented the bones from poking out and getting in my way. Last came binding the tabs, which was a similar process, just more fiddly. However, thanks to my wool tape and to the folded over seam allowances on the tabs, this was a lot less fiddly than it would have been otherwise. In total, it took me about 2 hours and 45 minutes to bind my stays, and I was doing this from about 4 a.m. to 6:45 in the morning, so I probably could have done it faster if I was more awake. I say this because if you decide to make stays and bind them, I recommend trying the wool tape. This is definitely going to be the prettiest outro I've ever shot here on the beach. I hope you enjoyed that video about making stays. I hope it was useful to you. Please don't hesitate to leave a comment if you have any questions. And yeah, don't forget to check out the rest of the content for CosTube Symposium. There's a lot of cool stuff going on. One thing that I wanted to note before I leave, I realized today that these stays are almost exactly the same size as the stays on which these are based. So I'm like almost the exact same size as the stays in a museum, which is just kind of wild to think about. I think that's all I have, so thank you to you for watching. Thanks to Ollie for his help in filming these beautiful beach scenes. And yeah, I hope you have a nice rest of your day. Bye! These stays are so comfortable, I'm willingly eating a tofu sandwich in them.